take a seat by the fire. Tonight, I'll share 6 true horror stories that happened during the quiet weeks before the winter holidays. Strange decorations, eerie winter markets, gifts that shouldn't exist, and things that walk long before the snow arrives. These stories come from people who were just trying to prepare for the season, until something else started preparing for them. This is Campfire Horror Tales, and these are 6 terrifying holiday preparation horror stories. I never planned on taking a seasonal job before the holidays, but money was tight. My regular hours had been cut, and when the city announced temporary positions for helping install early winter decorations, I figured it would be an easy way to catch up on bills. Most of the work was supposed to be simple. Hang lights, place small displays around the downtown park, and check that everything stayed where it belonged. Nothing dangerous, nothing stressful, just cold air and long evenings. That was fine with me. During our first briefing, the supervisor told us that the city wanted to get ahead of the weather and start setting up earlier than usual. It felt strange. Autumn wasn't even over, but I didn't mind. The park looked peaceful at dusk, and working alone gave me time to think. My shift usually began around 7 in the evening, when the streets were quiet and the shops were closing. For a while, it even felt calming. The problem started on the 3rd night. I was unloading a set of decorative figures shaped like children holding lanterns, the kind you see at winter festivals. They were made of lightweight, molded plastic, painted white with hollow eyes that lit from within, nothing unusual. But as I walked back and forth between the truck and the park path, I noticed something was off. One of the figures seemed to be turned slightly more than before. Its head, which had been facing forward, now leaned a little to the left. I brushed it off. Maybe I'd set it down wrong. But when I positioned the rest of the displays and returned to the first one, the head was facing me. The light inside its hollow eyes flickered faintly, as if reacting to my gaze. My breath formed a cloud in the cold air. I looked around. Nobody else was in the park, and the nearest street lamp buzzed quietly in the distance. I told myself I was tired and nudged the figure back into its original pose. Then I moved on. The next night, I brought a thermos and tried to focus on my tasks. But the figure, the same one, seemed to shift more drastically. When I approached the display area, I found it turned completely around, facing the bushes behind it. I knew for a fact I hadn't positioned it like that. The air around it felt oddly still, even though the branches nearby swayed gently in the evening breeze. The longer I stared, the more a tight, uncomfortable pressure built in my stomach. This time I checked the base of the figure. Maybe it wasn't secured properly. Maybe it had tilted on uneven ground. But the base was perfectly stable. It would have taken effort to move it, actual physical effort. And yet there it was, turned away from the path like it was hiding something. I reset it again and tried not to think about it. By the following week, the park looked almost festive. Lights wrapped around trees, garlands hung from railings, and more figures had been added around the central walkway. The children with lanterns display sat near the fountain, and every night, when I checked them, the same figure, The first one had changed position, sometimes only slightly, sometimes drastically. One evening, just after sunset, I found it standing several feet away from where I had left it. Not rotated, not tilted, moved. I froze. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I could see the drag marks across the concrete, small, faint scratches trailing behind its base. The figure's head was angled upward, as if looking at me, or over me, or through me. Its lantern glowed dimly, warm and soft. But the eyes looked darker than before. Deeper. I called my supervisor, pretending I had a question about wiring. I didn't dare mention the figure. He sounded annoyed and told me to finish my shift. That was the moment I realized I was completely alone with whatever was happening. The next night, I tried something different. I intentionally placed the figure facing away from the path, toward the empty lawn. Then I walked slowly backwards, keeping my eyes on it as long as I could. When I eventually turned the corner and broke line of sight, I counted to 60 and hurried back. It had moved again, only an inch, but moved. Its head was now angled over its shoulder just slightly, as if trying to catch me leaving. That was when I stopped pretending it was normal. On my last shift, the atmosphere felt wrong from the moment I stepped into the park. The air was colder than usual, and the lights seemed dimmer. I approached the fountain slowly, my boots crunching over fallen leaves. The display area came into view, and my stomach dropped. All the figures, every child with a lantern, were facing me. Some had been turned, some had been moved. They formed a loose semicircle around the path, as if they had gathered in silence to wait. Their lanterns glowed in a soft, synchronized pulse, like breathing. The one that had been moving all week stood closest. I couldn't look away from its hollow eyes. There was something inside them now, not light, not shadow, but something that understood I'd been watching. Something that had been watching back. I backed away slowly, then faster. Then I ran. I never returned to the job. I didn't answer the supervisor's calls. The display stayed up through the entire season. But I never went near the park again. Even now, months later, I still see that figure in my dreams, standing perfectly still until I blink. A friend once told me a story about the man who lived across the street from him, a quiet, polite older guy named Harris. He wasn't the type to draw attention. He worked from home, kept his yard clean, waved to neighbors, all the usual things. But last year, right in the middle of late autumn, Harris started putting up winter decorations far earlier than anyone else on the block. At first, my friend thought it was harmless. Some people get excited about the season. Some people try to brighten up the cold months. But something about the way Harris did it felt off. He began with a string of lights along his porch railing, nothing unusual. But the following morning, there were twice as many. Perfectly placed, evenly spaced, and plugged in. Harris hadn't been seen outside. No ladder had moved, no footsteps in the frost, no sound during the night. The lights were just there. Neat, silent, precise. My friend shrugged it off until the next day, when a set of glowing reindeer appeared beside the walkway. Again, no one saw him put them up. By the end of that week, the house looked like a full holiday display. But it wasn't even Thanksgiving yet. My friend tried joking with the neighbors about early cheer, but none of them laughed. Most admitted they never saw Harris outside. And yet the decorations kept multiplying. Some were classic, wreaths, garlands, another set of lights. But some looked older, almost handmade. Carved wooden figures, tiny lanterns that emitted a soft, warm glow. A tall, thin silhouette of a child holding a candle. And behind the candle, if you looked long enough, it almost appeared like a shadow moved. One night, my friend saw Harris standing in his doorway. The porch lights flickered behind him, and for a moment, my friend thought he was smiling. But the smile didn't look quite right. Too strained, too still. Almost like he wasn't the one making it. Then Harris stepped back inside, and the door closed. My friend felt cold all over. Not from the temperature outside, but from the feeling that the decorations weren't just for show. It was like the house itself was preparing for something. 2 days later, things escalated. A full row of small figures appeared along the walkway. Children, again. Some held candles. Some held bells. All of them faced the street, as though waiting for someone. Their shadows, cast across the lawn by the porch lights, seemed somehow longer than they should have been. When my friend walked past the house that night, he swore one of the figures had turned its head slightly. Not much, just a few degrees. But enough. He told me he tried to convince himself he imagined it. A trick from the lights, a passing car, fatigue. It was easier to believe that than consider the alternative. But when he told another neighbor about it, the man shook his head and said, "You think that's strange? Look at this." The neighbor lifted his phone and showed a picture he'd taken earlier that evening. The figures were arranged differently, not drastically, but noticeably. One that had been near the porch now stood closer to the mailbox. Another had been rotated completely around. None of them had been touched by human hands. At least, not by any hands the neighbors could see. The next morning, something new appeared on the porch. A tall wooden figure, painted in deep red and white. It looked vaguely like a holiday guardian, but its face was blank. Not empty, blank. Smooth wood, no features, no carving. Just a pale oval where a face should have been. And yet, in the right angle of light, my friend thought he could make out the faintest indentation, like something was pressing outward from inside. That night, things crossed a line. Around 2 a.m., my friend woke up to the sound of bells. Not loud ones, small, delicate ones. Ringing softly as if someone were passing through the yard, he peeked through his blinds. At first, all he saw was Harris's house, glowing faintly with lights. Then movement caught his eye. One of the wooden children stepped forward. Just one step, then another. Its candle flickered. Behind it, the rest of the figures seemed to lean, angled toward the street. Then he saw the blank-faced guardian. It wasn't on the porch anymore. It stood in the yard, tall, still facing the sidewalk. Its wooden surface reflected the glow of the lanterns. But the face, the blank, smooth face, tilted slightly upward, as if listening for something. My friend told me he froze. He didn't dare move. barely dared breathe. He watched the figures stand in complete silence for nearly a minute. Then their shadows stretched, unnaturally stretched, as though something passed behind them, a shape darker than night. When the shadows snapped back, the blank-faced figure was gone. The next morning, the decorations were back in their original positions. Every single one, neatly arranged, perfectly still, as if nothing had happened at all. My friend said he went to knock on Harris's door later that afternoon, desperate to ask what was going on. But Harris didn't answer. He didn't come outside for days. When my friend finally saw him again, he didn't look the same. His eyes seemed hollowed, tired, but calm, too calm. And when he spoke, his voice sounded distant, like someone whispering words into him. Now, when people decorate early on the street, my friend doesn't joke about it. He doesn't walk past Harris's house after sunset either. The lights are still there. The figures still stand in their places. But once in a while, a neighbor swears the tall guardian changes its position, especially when the nights grow longer. Last November, when the air still smelled like wet leaves and cold pavement, our town hosted its annual holiday prep market. It wasn't a full winter fair, more like an early season event where vendors sold candles, handmade ornaments, knitted scarves, and all the cozy things people used to lift the mood before the real freeze arrived. I'd gone every year with my parents when I was younger, but this time I went alone. I wanted a distraction. I had been dealing with a rough few months, and walking past warm lights and cheerful stalls sounded better than sitting at home with my thoughts. The market took place along Lantern Row, a narrow street lined with old brick buildings and strings of golden bulbs overhead. Early evening fog rolled low along the ground, making everything look dreamlike. People wandered from stand to stand, sipping hot drinks and comparing wreaths. It should have been comforting. But the longer I walked, the more I felt a strange pressure in my chest. Like the atmosphere wasn't festive at all, but expectant. Waiting. I tried to shake it off and kept browsing. I bought a jar of cinnamon honey, then a hand-carved snowflake ornament, then a cup of mulled cider. Normal things. Familiar things. But near the far end of the row, past where the lights dimmed and the crowd thinned, I noticed a booth I had never seen before. No banner. No price tags. Just a table covered in deep crimson fabric, illuminated by a single lantern that flickered oddly, almost like a heartbeat. Behind the table sat an older woman with silver hair pulled tightly back. She didn't call out to customers. She didn't smile. She simply watched the crowd with calm, unblinking eyes. When I walked by, she leaned forward slightly and said in a low, steady voice, "You're early this year." I stopped. Sorry? I've never been to your booth before." She tilted her head, as if studying something inside me rather than looking at my face. Everyone comes when they're ready. I almost walked away, but something kept me rooted in place. On the table lay a set of small wooden charms, each carved into a different shape: stars, leaves, bells, small animal figures. They looked handcrafted, detailed, strangely warm to the touch, even though I hadn't picked one up yet. A small sign lay at the center of the table. 3 words were burned into the wood. Choose your winter. I tried laughing it off. What does that mean? It means, she said softly, that every winter begins with a choice. Most don't know they've made it. I expected a pitch for some fortune-telling gimmick, but she didn't offer anything. She just waited. Against my better judgment, I reached for one of the charms, a tiny wooden lantern with a thin handle carved so delicately it looked like it could snap. The moment my fingers brushed it, the lantern's hollow center gave a faint glow. Not a reflection, not a trick of the booth light. A soft pulse. The woman nodded once. A path lit by what follows you. Something cold slid down my spine. What does that mean? She didn't answer. She wrapped the charm in dark cloth, tied it with twine, and handed it to me. I expected her to name a price, but instead she said, "You'll pay later." And that should have been the moment I walked away and didn't look back. But I took the charm and tucked it into my jacket. I didn't know why. Maybe curiosity? Maybe loneliness? Maybe something else? The fog seemed thicker on my way home. Streetlights buzzed overhead, flickering as I passed. I kept thinking about her voice, calm, confident, too certain. When I reached my apartment, I unwrapped the cloth and set the charm on my kitchen table. It looked ordinary now. Just wood. Just a carving. But around midnight, I heard a faint tapping sound from the living room. I assumed it was the heating system or a branch outside. When I stepped out to check, the charm was no longer on the table. It lay near the window. I hadn't touched it. I picked it up slowly. The wood felt warm again, almost like it pulsed. I placed it back on the table, resisting the urge to throw it away. Then I heard it, a soft rustling outside the window, like someone brushing against the wall. But I lived on the 3rd floor. The charm's tiny lantern glowed. I froze. The glow grew brighter, illuminating faint shapes in the dark glass of the window. Not reflections, not headlights. Figures, several of them. Tall, unmoving, their outlines barely visible through the fog outside. Their heads tilted slightly, as though listening. I backed away. The charm dimmed. The figures faded. I didn't sleep that night. The next afternoon, desperate for answers, I returned to Lantern Row. The market was open again, bustling with people. But when I reached the end of the street, the booth was gone. No crimson cloth, no lantern, no older woman, just empty pavement. I asked other vendors if they'd seen her, but every one of them shook their head. There had been no such booth, they insisted. Not this year. Not any year. For days afterward, the charm kept moving on its own, sometimes toward the door, sometimes toward the window. And every evening, the faint outlines appeared outside my building, closer each time, waiting, watching. I keep the charm locked in a drawer now, wrapped tightly in its cloth. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint rhythm of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, steady, getting closer. Maybe winter really does begin with a choice, and maybe I chose wrong. My grandmother used to tell me stories that didn't feel like folklore. They didn't have morals or lessons or cozy endings. They felt more like warnings. She grew up in a small mountain village, the kind that still kept strange traditions long after the rest of the world forgot them. Most of her stories were harmless, old superstitions, silly rituals, things meant to entertain a child. But there was one she told me only once. In a quiet voice, as if speaking it too loudly might call something closer. She said that before the winter holidays, long before the deep snow arrived, people in her village performed a private ritual. They didn't talk about it. They didn't write it down. It wasn't something tourists ever heard about. It wasn't even something neighbors discussed openly. Each household decided on its own night to do it, usually sometime in late autumn, when the days felt shorter and the wind carried the first scent of ice. They called it leaving the first gift. The idea was simple, she said. Before the season of celebration, you had to leave a small handmade offering outside your home, not to a spirit or a saint, but to something older, something that passed through the village before the real winter arrived. They never said its name. They only called it the one who walks before winter. My grandmother told me that each house left a different kind of gift. Some carved wooden shapes, some baked small loaves of dark bread, some simply left candles in clay bowls. It wasn't the object that mattered. It was the act. The acknowledgement. A sign that you recognized the presence of something moving silently through the valley. If you didn't leave a gift, she said, he would knock. I laughed when she first told me that, because I assumed it was a story meant to make children behave. But she didn't smile back. She looked at the window behind me, as though expecting to see something through the glass. She told me that when she was 12, her family had fallen on hard times. Her father died that year. Her mother became ill. They had no money, no spare food, and no strength to keep up old customs. So when the time came for leaving the first gift, her mother insisted they skip it. We have nothing to give, she said. Winter will come whether we do the ritual or not. The knock came 2 nights later. My grandmother said it happened just after sunset. 3 slow knocks, not loud, not threatening, just patient. The kind of knock that says, I know you're inside. I know you're awake. And I know you forgot me. Her mother froze. Her brother hid under the table. My grandmother was told to stay silent. The knocking came again. 3 steady taps that echoed through the wooden walls. Then the sound of footsteps moved across the porch. Not heavy steps, not light ones. Just wrong. Like something dragging slightly, pausing between each move. Then came the breathing. She said it wasn't like a person catching their breath, or the wind pushing through cracks. It was slow, deep, and close, as if someone were standing right outside their door, leaning in, listening. Her mother finally whispered, "We must give something." But they had nothing prepared. No bread, no carving, not even a candle. So her mother took one of her daughter's old scarves, a faded red one, tied it in a careful knot, and placed it outside, right on the doorstep. She didn't open the door wide, just enough to slide the offering through. The breathing stopped. When morning came, the scarf was gone. I remember being unsettled by the story, but not scared. It felt distant, like one of those old tales people cling to out of habit. My grandmother must have sensed my doubt, because she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "I still hear him sometimes," she said, "even miles away from that village. When the season turns, when the air changes, when the dark comes earlier than it should." I didn't believe her then. I believed her years later. A few autumns ago, right before the holiday rush began, I visited her at her old house. It was late November, and the sky had the heavy look of approaching snow. Before I left that night, she pressed a small wooden charm into my hand, a carved shape of a candle. It was simple, a little uneven, clearly made by hand. I asked why she wanted me to have it. "So you don't forget," she said. "Winter does not always arrive alone." That night, as I drove home, the wind pushed hard against my car. The temperature dropped faster than expected, and the road emptied until mine was the only set of headlights for a mile. I turned off the radio. The silence inside the car felt heavy. Then, just past a bend, I heard it. 3 slow knocks. Not on my door, not on the window. Somewhere beneath the sound of the engine. So faint at first, I thought it was part of the road noise. But then it came again. 3 patient taps, spaced just like my grandmother described. My hands tightened on the wheel. I didn't dare look around. I didn't dare slow down. The air inside the car felt colder. My breath fogged the windshield even with the heat on. The wooden charm in my pocket warmed against my leg. Not hot, just warm enough to notice. Warm enough to feel like someone was holding it. When I finally reached home and stepped out of the car, the air was still. No wind, no movement, no sound. But on my doorstep, lying neatly beside the welcome mat, was the red scarf my grandmother had described. The exact one. Frayed, faded, folded. I haven't asked her about it. I don't think I want to know the answer. But every year now, before the first frost hits, I leave something outside. A candle, a bit of bread, even a simple wooden charm. Because I've learned one thing. Winter is never the first to arrive. I worked the night shift at a large supermarket last year, the kind that starts preparing for the holidays way earlier than anyone wants. Most people don't know this, but winter stock arrives long before December, sometimes even before Thanksgiving. My job was simple. Unload shipments, sort items, and place them in the seasonal aisle so the morning crew could arrange everything for display. It wasn't exciting, but it paid well enough. And I liked the quiet. One evening in mid-November, a truck arrived late with a shipment labeled Holiday Fragile. Handle with care. The boxes looked older than the usual polished, bright packaging we got from major suppliers. These were plain cardboard, sealed with dark tape and stamped with no company name. Just a date, handwritten in marker, 1964. I assumed it was a misprint or part of some retro theme. We had started selling vintage-inspired decorations, so it didn't seem too strange. Still, something about those boxes felt wrong the moment I touched them. They were colder than the others, like they'd been stored in a freezer, even though the truck wasn't refrigerated. When I stacked them in the stockroom, the air around me felt unnaturally still. No humming from the lights, no distant music from the overnight radio. Just silence. I cut open the first box and found rows of glass ornaments. Old-fashioned, hand-painted, delicate. Reds, golds, blues, each one decorated with tiny winter scenes, children by a frozen lake, a snowy church, a small village lit by lanterns. They were beautiful, in a strange, melancholy way. Every ornament felt heavier than it looked, like it held more than glass inside. The second box held figurines, small glass children holding candles, similar to the ones in Story 1, but more detailed. Too detailed. Their faces were incredibly lifelike for items supposedly made decades ago. Their eyes were painted so realistically, they seemed to glisten when the overhead lights flickered. And they flickered a lot that night. As I arranged the ornaments on a cart, I heard a soft sound, a faint clink like glass tapping glass. I thought I'd bumped something, but nothing had moved. When I leaned in, listening, I heard it again. A light, rhythmic tapping coming from inside the unopened boxes. I stepped back, probably shifting from temperature change. I muttered, but my voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. I decided to get everything out onto the sales floor quickly so I wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. The store felt different that night, darker, even with all the lights on. Shadows stretched in odd angles across the aisles. The holiday section was in the back corner, where the ceilings were higher and the lights buzzed loudly. I placed the boxes on a shelf and bent down to open the last carton. More ornaments, but these were painted differently. Each one had a tiny silhouette inside the snowy scene, a dark figure standing far from the village, half hidden behind trees. Every ornament. Same figure, same stance, same unnatural stillness. A chill ran up my arms. I hung a few on the display tree, trying to ignore the feeling crawling under my skin. But the moment I stepped back, something shifted. One of the glass children figurines, the ones holding candles, now faced a different direction. It had been facing the aisle. Now it faced me. I froze. No one else was in the store. No one had walked past. And those figurines were heavy. They didn't move without being touched. A soft jingling sound came from behind me. When I turned, a box of silver bells, unopened, shook slightly on the shelf. Just once. Then stopped. I backed away slowly. When I reached the end of the aisle, the lights above me flickered hard enough to buzz. Every ornament hanging on the tree chimed at the same moment. A delicate, eerie shimmer of sound like whispered laughter pressed into glass. I didn't imagine that. The sound was too real. I told myself to breathe, that it was exhaustion, lack of sleep, the cold stockroom messing with my nerves. I decided to finish my shift in a different part of the store. The canned goods aisle was brightly lit, safe, normal. But even there, I felt watched. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see one of those glass children standing at the end of the aisle. When I returned to the seasonal section later to clock out, I wished I hadn't. The ornaments I'd hung were rearranged, not slightly, entirely. They formed a perfect ring around the tree, all facing outward. Beneath them, the glass children stood in a circle, each one angled toward the store entrance, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Their candle tips glowed faintly. A warm flicker. Impossible. They weren't wired for lights. As I approached, every candle glow dimmed at the exact same moment. Like they knew I was there. I backed away slowly until I reached the time clock. I didn't even change out of my uniform. I left, keys shaking in my hand, trying not to run. I didn't go back the next night. I called in sick. When I finally returned 2 days later, the seasonal aisle looked normal. No rings of ornaments, no glowing candles, no rearranged figurines. Except one thing. On the bottom shelf, where only employees usually look, sat a single ornament, one I hadn't displayed. The snowy village scene was the same, but now the dark figure inside stood closer to the glass, and this time, it wasn't alone. Beside it was a second silhouette. Smaller, its head tilted slightly, like it was listening. I quit a week later. Sometimes, if I walk past that store at night, I swear I see faint candlelight flickering behind the glass doors. I tell myself it's my imagination, that it's just holiday decor reflecting from traffic. But deep down, I know the truth. Those ornaments aren't decorations. They're watchers. A friend of mine, Daniel, used to teach part-time at a community center after school. He worked with kids who wanted to join the winter choir, the one that performed downtown every December when the city lit its holiday tree. He loved it, said it felt like watching the season slowly come alive through their excitement. But last year, something changed. Something he still won't talk about unless he's had a drink or two and the room is quiet. He told me the first sign came in late autumn, during their evening practices. The building was old and drafty, the kind with faded tiles and buzzing lights. Most nights were routine. Kids practicing simple harmonies, warm-ups, laughter echoing through the hall. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. Until the night a new melody appeared. He said it started with a single voice, one of the younger boys in the back row. During warm-ups, while everyone hummed simple notes, the boy let out a soft, unfamiliar tune. It wasn't loud, just enough for Daniel to hear beneath the others. A slow, wavering pattern of notes that didn't belong to any song he'd taught. When Daniel asked him what it was, the boy shrugged and said he didn't remember singing anything. The next practice, 2 more children joined in. Same tune. Same strange rise and fall in the melody. Their eyes looked distant, as if they were concentrating on something far away. Something only they could hear. Daniel stopped the rehearsal and asked where they learned the song. They all gave the same answer. We didn't. By the end of the week, almost half the choir hummed the melody, not loudly, quietly, under their breath, sometimes even when the room was silent, like they were practicing something whispered directly into their minds. Daniel tried to record it on his phone once, but the audio came out distorted. A static-filled mess that hurt his ears when he played it back. He told the parents the kids might be picking it up online, some viral trend or weird audio. But none of the parents had heard it before. One mother even insisted the tune made her uneasy. "It sounds like someone calling from far away," she said. "Like echoing snow." Practice sessions grew worse. The kids stopped talking before warm-ups. They'd stand still, eyes unfocused, waiting for Daniel to cue them in. But as soon as he gave the note, they ignored it and drifted into the other melody. Their voices blended perfectly, eerily, rising and falling as one. None of them knew the words. But that didn't stop them from mouthing shapes, like something was teaching them syllables their tongues weren't meant to form. Daniel said it was the most unnatural harmony he'd ever heard. Too smooth, too synchronized. Children shouldn't be able to match pitch that precisely. Not without training, not without years of practice. One night, near the end of November, he decided to film the rehearsal to show the choir director. He set his phone down and started warm-ups as usual. The kids lifted their heads in unison, perfectly in unison, and began the melody again. Then something shifted. Their voices grew deeper. Not lower, deeper. Like each note had weight, pressure. The air in the room vibrated. Daniel felt it in his chest, like the resonant hum of a distant engine. Some of the overhead lights flickered, others dimmed. He called out their names. None of them responded. Then the kids opened their eyes. For weeks, he'd said their eyes looked unfocused, glazed. But now they were fixed on him, all of them, at once. And in that moment, Daniel felt something he never forgot. The unmistakable sensation that they weren't looking at him. They were looking through him. The melody swelled, filling the room. It wasn't just a tune anymore. It was layered, complex, almost like multiple voices singing through each child's throat. The shadows behind them stretched along the wall, longer than they should have, bending at strange angles as though cast by a light source that wasn't in the room. Daniel finally snapped out of his shock and shouted for them to stop. When he hit the light switch, the music cut off instantly. Every child collapsed to their knees at the same time, gasping, clutching their chests like they'd run miles. Some burst into tears. Some stared blankly ahead. None remembered what happened. 3 of them didn't show up the next day. Their parents said they never made it home from school. Police searched the neighborhood, the woods, the nearby river trail. No signs, no footprints, no witnesses. Just vanished. But Daniel told me the worst part wasn't the disappearance. It was the community center security footage. He said the cameras caught everything, except the kids. The footage showed Daniel in the room, talking to empty space, raising his hands, playing notes on the piano, walking around the rehearsal hall, reacting to something that wasn't there. But the room was empty. No children, no choir, just Daniel and the flickering lights. He quit the job the next day. Sometimes, late at night, he hears the melody again. Faint, drifting across quiet streets when the cold wind picks up. He swears it sounds like children singing, not crying, not calling, just singing. And every winter since, 3 new names get added to the list of missing kids from surrounding towns. Daniel thinks the melody wasn't teaching the children a song. He thinks it was calling them home.